When 11-year-old Clara returned to Caldermere Hall, she refused her third governess, and the family trustees warned that another failure could cost the Duke his guardianship. Then Clara asked for the woman who had taught her to sleep without a candle, and described Eleanor Vale, the woman he had publicly denied loving. The governess's carriage was still visible beyond the iron gates when Julian Arthur Ashcombe entered the schoolroom. A chair lay on its side beside the cold fireplace, and 3 books formed a careful line across the carpet. Clara sat beneath the window in her gray traveling dress, her arms around her knees as rain traced narrow paths down the glass. Mr. Harcourt and Mr. Bellamy, the trustees responsible for Clara's inheritance, stood near the writing table. Harcourt had closed his notebook, though Julian knew from the man's expression that the matter was not finished. "Mrs. Parkin has resigned, Your Grace." Julian righted the chair. "So I understand." The trustees summarized the morning. Mrs. Parkin had attempted to rearrange the schoolroom, Clara had locked the door, and no one had persuaded her to eat or sleep until nearly dawn. 3 governesses had now left Caldermere in less than a year. The court would not continue treating each departure as a private household difficulty. Mr. Harcourt opened the notebook again. "We can allow 6 weeks for a final assessment. During that period, Lady Augusta Fenwick's petition will remain suspended." Clara's head lifted at her grandmother's name. Lady Augusta's home was orderly, respectable, and filled with cousins. It was also ruled by a woman who believed grief could be corrected through discipline, proper meals, and silence at the proper hours. "You will not send me there," Clara said. "No one is sending you anywhere today," Julian replied. That is not what he said. The rebuke was quiet, but it struck harder than an outburst. Since Lydia's death, Julian had chosen Clara's rooms, instructors, clothing, and daily routine. Each decision had seemed necessary. Now he understood that necessity had become his answer before anyone else was allowed a question. Mr. Bellamy asked whether Clara had trusted any teacher or companion during the past year. At first she refused to answer. Then her fingers loosened around her skirt. There was a lady at Briar House. Harcourt recognized the name as a small educational residence near Hawthorne Beck for girls recovering from bereavement or isolation. Julian did not. He asked how Clara had come to visit it. "Mrs. Parkin took me while we stayed with her sister," Clara said. "She said the lessons there might make me behave." "And the woman you met?" Clara watched the rain. "Mrs. Vale." For a moment, the room seemed to lose its depth. Mr. Bellamy asked whether Julian knew her. He replied that there might be several women by that name, though the words sounded weak even to him. Clara continued. Mrs. Vale had dark hair marked with silver, wore serious dresses, and carried a small silver thimble on a chain at her waist. Julian remembered that thimble against plum-colored silk in a London drawing-room. Eleanor had once told him that her mother taught her not to hide every tear in a piece of cloth. Some damage should be repaired well enough to remain strong, without pretending it had never existed. Years later, Julian had chosen to tear their courtship apart in public. "What did she do for you?" he asked. She waited. The answer was too simple for the trustees, so Clara explained. Eleanor had not taken away the candle or demanded that she sleep in darkness. On the first night, she placed it on the table instead of beside the bed. On the second, she moved it near the door. By the fourth, Clara had fallen asleep before anyone lit it. "She asked before moving my books," Clara added, "and when I did not speak, she did not tell everyone I was rude." Mr. Harcourt looked from the girl to Julian. "Would you cooperate with the assessment if Mrs. Vale were present?" Clara answered at once. "Yes." "And with another governess?" "No." The trustees made the consequence clear. If Eleanor agreed to assist, and Clara showed real progress, Julian might retain the guardianship. If Eleanor refused, or if another arrangement failed, Lady Augusta's petition would proceed. A plan formed in Julian's mind with familiar speed. He could send his secretary, offer a generous fee, arrange a carriage, prepare a guest suite, and remove every practical obstacle before Eleanor arrived. Then Clara spoke again. "You must ask her." Julian turned. "Not order her," she said, "and not decide she is coming before she says yes." By noon, Julian had ordered only one thing: his own carriage. He sent no letter ahead, he prepared no room, and made no offer through a solicitor. As Caldermere disappeared behind the bare trees, he understood that Eleanor might refuse even to receive him. For the first time in years, the Duke of Caldermere was traveling toward a decision he could not make for anyone but himself. Briar House stood beyond a low stone wall at the edge of Hawthorne Beck, where the village road narrowed between fields and a line of ash trees. The building had once been a modest country home. Its pale walls showed signs of age, but the windows were clean, the roof had been repaired, and a small vegetable garden remained orderly despite the season. Julian noticed these details before the carriage stopped. Nothing about the place suggested wealth, everything suggested care. Inside, Eleanor Margaret Vale was reviewing the monthly accounts with Miss Avery, the senior teacher. A column of figures had been corrected twice, but the result remained the same. Briar House could continue through the winter. It could not continue into another year without a permanent agreement or several new supporters. The letter on Eleanor's desk offered one solution. The Northern Ladies Benevolent Association was willing to take control of the residence, settle its immediate debts, and guarantee places for 12 girls. In return, the association would appoint its own director, approve every lesson, and remove the older residents once they reached a fixed age. They would keep the building open, Miss Avery said. They would keep the name, Eleanor replied. That is not the same thing. The association's plan described the girls as dependents requiring supervision. It made no mention of preparing them to manage money, seek respectable work, or make decisions about their own futures. Eleanor had spent 8 years building a house where grief was not treated as disobedience and gratitude was not demanded in exchange for shelter. She folded the letter and placed it beneath the account book. "We shall answer on Monday." Miss Avery understood that this meant Eleanor intended to refuse, though neither woman yet knew how the next quarter's expenses would be met. A knock sounded below. Moments later, one of the younger residents entered the office and announced that a gentleman had arrived in a dark carriage. She seemed impressed by the horses and suspicious of the man. He gave his name as the Duke of Caldermere. Eleanor's hand remained on the closed account book. For years, she had imagined what she might feel if Julian ever stood before her again. Anger would have been simple, so would contempt. Instead, she felt a sharp awareness of the room, the weak fire, the worn carpet, the letter beneath her hand, and disliked that his arrival could still change the meaning of ordinary things. "Show him to the front parlor," she said. Julian was standing when she entered. Time had placed gray at his temples and deeper lines beside his mouth, but it had not softened the authority with which he occupied a room. His coat was damp from the rain. He had removed his gloves and held them in one hand, as if uncertain where to put them. Eleanor closed the door but did not offer her hand. "Your Grace." Mrs. Vale. The title carried all the years between them. Once, when they had expected a future together, he had spoken her name without caution. Now even courtesy required distance. He began by explaining Clara's return to Caldermere, the departure of Mrs. Parkin, and the trustee's 6-week assessment. Eleanor listened without interrupting. His account was clear, but she noticed how often he spoke of the estate, the court, and his guardianship before speaking of Clara herself. When he finished, Eleanor asked, "What does the child believe is happening?" "She knows that Lady Augusta has asked for custody." "That was not my question." Julian paused. "She believes the adults around her have already decided where she will live." "Have they?" "No." "Have you told her what she may choose?" "There are limits to what an 11-year-old can decide. There are also limits to what adults should decide without her." The old familiarity made disagreement too easy. Eleanor could still recognize the moment Julian became uncertain because his voice grew more formal and his expression less readable. He explained that Clara had asked for her by name. She had described the nights at Briar House and the silver thimble. The trustees were willing to consider Eleanor's involvement as evidence that Clara could settle at Caldermere. Eleanor moved toward the window. Several girls were crossing the yard with baskets of folded linen. One stumbled, recovered, and pushed away the hand offered by her companion before accepting it a moment later. "You want me to become her governess," Eleanor said. "No, a consultant, perhaps. You would have freedom to establish whatever routine you consider appropriate." "Freedom granted by you. I am trying to make the arrangement possible. You are trying to make refusal difficult." Julian did not deny it at once. That honesty, small as it was, unsettled her more than an argument might have done. He offered a generous fee and separate accommodation. Eleanor refused, both before he could present the details. Briar House would not become dependent on Caldermere, and she would not enter his household under a title that could be withdrawn when her conclusions became inconvenient. "This is about Clara," he said. "Then speak of Clara. Do not speak of what Caldermere requires from me." Julian looked toward the yard. "She has stopped sleeping. She tests every adult until they leave, and each departure convinces her that the next person will do the same. I have tried structure. I have tried patience. I have tried leaving her alone when she asks for it, and remaining near when she does not. Nothing lasts." It was the first thing he had said that sounded less like a duke presenting a case, and more like a man admitting failure. Eleanor's resolve did not disappear, but it changed shape. He told her that Clara would be sent to Fenwick House if the assessment failed. Lady Augusta could provide family, cousins, and a stable routine. Julian described those advantages fairly, which made Eleanor trust the danger more, not less. "Augusta loves her," he said, "but she believes obedience creates safety. And you? I believe safety requires someone willing to take responsibility." Eleanor met his eyes. "That is not always different." The words remained between them. Julian then referred to the past. He said that the end of their courtship had been connected to documents left by Thomas Vale and to an investigation involving Clara's inheritance. He began to explain that caution had been necessary. Eleanor stopped him. "Do not come here after all these years and ask me to judge your cruelty by the danger you faced. You may explain the investigation when you are prepared to explain the choice you made within it." He lowered his head once, accepting the distinction without agreement. Eleanor refused to return with him. She would not enter Caldermere because the trustees required a solution or because Julian had finally discovered that one could not command trust into existence. After he left, the house seemed quieter than before. That evening, Miss Avery brought Eleanor a letter from a former resident now employed near Fenwick House. The young woman described Lady Augusta's home as orderly and affectionate in its own restrained fashion. Clara would have cousins near her age, meals at fixed hours, and a grandmother present every day. She would also be expected to accept decisions without discussion and to overcome distress without allowing it to disturb the household. Eleanor read the letter twice. Remaining away would protect everything she had rebuilt. It might also leave Clara to choose between Julian's private control and Augusta's public certainty. Before retiring, Eleanor wrote a brief note to Caldermere. She would visit Clara once. The visit would create no contract, no promise, and no obligation to remain. It was not forgiveness. It was an assessment. Eleanor arrived at Caldermere shortly after 10 the next morning. She had chosen a plain, dark dress suitable for travel, and brought only a leather case containing paper, pencils, and the notes she had made after Clara's visits to Briar House. A footman led her through the west entrance rather than the formal hall. She noticed the choice. Julian had remembered that she disliked being announced before a room of strangers. The consideration might have meant something if the rest of the household had not already been prepared for her arrival. A maid waited at the top of the stairs with fresh linens. A tray had been placed in a guest room overlooking the south lawn, and Eleanor's name had been written on a card beside the door. When the housekeeper explained that the room would remain hers for the 6 weeks, Eleanor stopped. "I am visiting for one day." The housekeeper's expression changed only slightly. His Grace believed you might prefer to have your belongings brought from Briar House after luncheon. Eleanor understood immediately. Julian had avoided sending a carriage to collect her, but he had still arranged the outcome before receiving her consent. She found him in the library with Mr. Harcourt and a stack of documents. He rose when she entered, and the brief relief on his face disappeared when he saw the room key in her hand. "You prepared a room for me. I wanted you to have privacy if you chose to remain. You informed the servants that I had already chosen." Julian glanced at the key. "The room can be closed. The room is not the problem." The trustees became interested in their papers. Eleanor placed the key on the desk and explained that she would leave before evening. If further visits became necessary, she would travel from Briar House. She would not allow convenience to become an agreement she had never made. Julian listened without interruption. Years earlier, he would have defended the arrangement by listing every practical advantage. This time, he asked the housekeeper to remove Eleanor's name from the door and make no plans beyond the day. The correction was immediate, but it did not erase the instinct that had made it necessary. Clara was waiting in the morning room. She sat behind a small table with a book open before her, though Eleanor could see that she had not turned a page in some time. Relief crossed the girl's face when Eleanor entered, followed almost at once by suspicion. "You came." "I said I would. Are you staying?" "Until this afternoon." Clara closed the book. "Then there is no point." She pushed back her chair and moved toward the window. Eleanor did not stop her. Instead, she opened her leather case and placed a small piece of torn linen on the table, beside 2 spools of thread. Clara looked over despite herself. "The edge is worse," she said. "It was caught on a nail. You should throw it away." "It can still be used." Clara returned slowly to the table. Eleanor did not ask her to sit. She threaded a needle and made one uneven stitch before offering it to the girl. Clara refused. Eleanor continued alone. After several minutes, Clara asked whether the repair would show. "Yes. Then it will look spoiled. It will look repaired." The answer did not please her, but it held her attention. Julian entered quietly and stopped near the door. Eleanor saw Clara notice him, though neither acknowledged his presence. When he stepped closer to the table, the girl placed one hand over the 3 books beside her. Julian paused. "May I move these?" he asked. Clara studied him before nodding. He placed the books on a side table and withdrew without touching anything else. The action was small, but Eleanor saw the effort behind it. Clara did too. By midday, Eleanor had learned more from what the girl avoided than from what she said. Clara knew exactly which floorboards sounded beneath a servant's step. She watched doors when adults discussed plans. She became angry whenever anyone used the word permanent, and she denied being tired even when she could no longer concentrate. She also lied about sleeping through the night. Eleanor did not accuse her. She asked Clara to draw the position of the candle at bedtime. The first mark appeared beside the pillow. The second was placed near the edge of the table. When Eleanor asked where it had been before dawn, Clara covered the page with her hand. "I do not remember. You may leave that part blank." Clara looked suspicious. "You are not going to tell him I lied." "I am going to tell him that you are not ready to answer." From the doorway, Julian heard the distinction. The trustees returned after luncheon to formalize the terms of the assessment. Julian had expected them to approve a private educational arrangement. Instead, Mr. Harcourt informed them that Eleanor's previous work with Clara made complete independence necessary. Mrs. Vale would not serve as an employee of the Duke. Her observations would be submitted directly to the trustees, and nothing in her report would be altered by Caldermere before review. She would be permitted to examine records affecting Clara's education, residence, and emotional welfare. Julian's expression hardened. "You intend to give an outsider authority over my household?" Eleanor answered before Harcourt could. "No, they intend to give Clara an observer who does not depend on your approval." The distinction was uncomfortable because it was accurate. Mr. Harcourt added that Eleanor's conclusions could support Julian's guardianship or strengthen Lady Augusta's petition. If either party objected, the trustees would appoint someone else. Clara stood near the fireplace, listening to every word. Eleanor asked that the conditions be stated in language the girl could understand. Harcourt began again, explaining that Eleanor would watch, ask questions, and write what she believed was true. She would not decide alone where Clara lived, but her opinion would matter. Clara looked at Eleanor. "You might tell them I should leave?" "Yes." The answer frightened her, but Eleanor would not begin their work with a comforting lie. "And you might tell them I should stay?" "Yes." "Then whose side are you on?" "Yours." Clara did not appear satisfied. She was old enough to understand that adults often used such answers before doing what they already intended. Eleanor set her own terms. She would continue directing Briar House, would sleep there unless an emergency required otherwise, and would accept no payment that made the institution dependent on Caldermere. Julian would provide access to relevant information, and Clara would be told before any major change in her routine. Julian agreed to each condition, though the promise concerning information required the longest silence. When the meeting ended, Clara followed Eleanor into the schoolroom. She had found the torn linen folded beside the sewing basket. "Will you come tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes." "And the next day?" "Yes." "For 6 weeks?" "If the arrangement remains useful and honest." Clara frowned at the final word. Adults always add something after yes. Sometimes they should. Eleanor gave her a narrow notebook covered in plain brown cloth. It was not a diary and would not be read without permission. Clara could use it to record small things that became easier, harder, or different. What am I supposed to write? Whatever is true. Clara opened to the first page. Her handwriting was uneven, and she misspelled 2 words before pressing the pencil too hard through the paper. "Uncle Julian asked, before moving my books." She closed the notebook before Eleanor could read more. That evening, Eleanor returned to Briar House. Julian did not offer to stop her, send for her belongings, or reopen the prepared room. After her carriage left, he went upstairs and found the card bearing her name, still resting on a table outside the empty guest chamber. He picked it up, tore it once through the center, and placed the pieces in the fire. It was not a sacrifice. It was only the first decision he had undone before someone else was forced to live with it. Over the next 9 days, Eleanor divided her time between Briar House and Caldermere. She arrived after breakfast, remained through Clara's lessons and afternoon rest, then returned before the evening meal whenever possible. The arrangement was inconvenient for everyone, which helped preserve its honesty. No one could pretend she had quietly become part of Julian's household. Clara's progress came in changes too small to impress anyone who did not know how closely fear could govern a child's habits. She began leaving the schoolroom door partly open instead of locking it. She allowed the housekeeper to replace the bed linens while she remained in the room. On the 4th night, she slept until the mantel clock struck twice before calling for a lamp. The next morning she recorded the event in the brown notebook. Slept until the clock rang 2 times. Did not shout when Mrs. Bell came in. Eleanor did not correct the grammar. The entry mattered because Clara had chosen to write it. Julian also began making changes, though his first attempts were stiff enough to reveal how unnatural consultation still felt to him. Before moving a stack of books from Clara's writing desk, he asked where she wanted them placed. When a riding lesson had to be delayed because of rain, he told her, before informing the groom. Neither decision was important by itself, but Clara watched him as if each request for permission were evidence in a private trial. One afternoon, Julian found Eleanor examining the notebook with Clara's consent. He remained by the door until the girl looked up. "I have been invited to dine with the trustees on Friday," he said. "Lady Augusta will also attend." Clara's pencil stopped. Julian explained that the gathering would be small and that her presence might reassure the trustees that family contact could occur without distress. His tone was careful, but Eleanor heard the assumption beneath it. He had already decided the dinner would help. Clara asked whether she had to attend. Julian replied that it would be useful, which was not an answer. Eleanor waited until the girl had gone to the library before following him into the corridor. "You are asking her to perform stability for the men deciding where she will live. I am asking her to eat dinner with her grandmother. In front of trustees who will measure every silence. They must see that she can remain part of a family. They must see the truth, not a demonstration arranged for their comfort." Julian's expression tightened. He had become more willing to listen, but he had not become less proud. If she refuses every occasion that causes discomfort, she will learn that fear is sufficient reason to withdraw from life. And if you place her before an audience because it strengthens your case, she will learn that affection is another duty she must perform. They had reached the narrow gallery overlooking the entrance hall. Below them, servants crossed between rooms carrying flowers and folded linen for the coming dinner. Eleanor realized the preparations had already begun. "You decided before asking her," she said. "I considered what was necessary." "You still believe silence can protect everyone, Julian." His face changed at the use of his name. "And you still believe leaving is the only honest choice." For several seconds, neither of them moved. The argument had ceased to concern dinner alone. Julian stood close enough for Eleanor to remember the familiar warmth of him beside her at crowded London gatherings, when a quiet touch at her elbow had once meant that they understood each other without explanation. His hand lifted slightly, as though memory had directed it toward her face. He stopped before touching her. Eleanor stepped back. The distance was small, but final enough for the moment. "Ask Clara what she can manage," she said. "Do not ask her to prove what you wish the trustees to believe." Julian did ask. Clara agreed to attend for one course, on the condition that she could leave without explanation if she became overwhelmed. The compromise was sensible, but the damage had already spread farther than either adult knew. Clara had heard only the final part of their argument from the library doorway. She did not understand the history between them. She understood only that Eleanor had spoken of leaving and that Julian had sounded angry. That evening, a page disappeared from the brown notebook. Lady Augusta arrived at Briar House 2 days before the dinner. She came without Julian, without a companion, and without the formal warning Eleanor would have expected from a woman of her position. Her carriage waited beyond the gate while she examined the workroom, the kitchen garden, and the small classroom where 3 girls were learning household accounts. Augusta was not warm, but neither was she dismissive. She asked precise questions about staffing, discipline, and the length of time residents remained at Briar House. Eleanor answered with equal directness. Only when they were alone in the office did Augusta mention Clara. "You have helped her," she said. "I do not deny it." "That sounds like the beginning of a disagreement." "It is the beginning of a distinction." Augusta described Fenwick House without pretending it was perfect. Clara would have cousins near her age, a predictable schedule, and a woman present every morning and evening. The household did not revolve around a duke whose duties often drew him away, nor around servants trained to obey him before questioning whether obedience served the child. "Caldermere is full of people who wait for Julian to decide what they think," Augusta said. "That is not stability. It is silence with polished furniture." Eleanor could not dismiss the accusation. Augusta's strongest argument came without cruelty. A child may cling to the first person who permits her to avoid what frightens her. That does not always mean she is healing. The words remained with Eleanor after the visit ended. Clara had begun asking whether Eleanor would attend every difficult conversation. She wanted Eleanor seated beside her during meals, lessons, and meetings with Augusta. What had begun as trust was in danger of becoming dependence. The following day, Eleanor altered the arrangement. She told Clara that the girl would speak to Julian directly about the dinner and would meet Augusta for 15 minutes without Eleanor in the room. Clara reacted badly. She accused Eleanor of changing the rules and refused to open the notebook. When Eleanor did not withdraw the decision, the girl said that Lady Augusta had been right to dislike Briar House. The remark was intended to wound. It succeeded. Eleanor maintained the boundary, but not with perfect calm. She became formal, ended the lesson early, and spent the next hour reviewing documents instead of attempting another conversation. She recognized the retreat for what it was, only after Clara had left the room. Julian controlled by deciding too much. Eleanor controlled by becoming unreachable when she was hurt. The dinner took place with fewer difficulties than expected. Clara remained through the first course, answered 2 questions, and left when the noise became too much. Augusta did not stop her. Julian did not ask her to stay. The trustees recorded the evening as a partial success. That success made Eleanor's first formal report more difficult to write. She stated that Clara had shown real improvement and that Caldermere possessed the resources necessary for her care. She also recorded that Julian continued to prepare decisions before consulting the child, that important information remained concentrated in his hands, and that Clara's growing dependence on Eleanor required correction. The report recommended continued assessment rather than immediate confirmation of the guardianship. Julian received a copy before the trustees' next meeting. He came to Briar House that afternoon carrying the document folded once in his hand. Eleanor expected anger. What she saw was something quieter and more personal. "You believe I may be unfit to keep her. I believe love does not remove the need for scrutiny. You might have spoken to me before sending this. I have spoken to you, more than once." His disappointment unsettled her because it carried an expectation he had never admitted. The work between them had become easier. Their conversations had lengthened. He had begun to trust her judgment in the household. Somewhere within that progress, Julian had mistaken intimacy for allegiance. "I thought," he began, then stopped, "that I would protect you, that you understood what losing her would mean." "I do understand. That is why the report cannot be convenient." The trustees' response arrived the next morning. Lady Augusta's petition would remain active, and a temporary move to Fenwick House was still possible if the next assessment revealed further instability. Clara learned of the decision from a servant who had overheard 2 men discussing the letter. She found Eleanor in the schoolroom and threw the brown notebook onto the table. "You told them to send me away." "I told them what I observed." "You said you were on my side." "I am." "No. You write things and people leave." The accusation was followed by something harsher. "Perhaps that is what you do. You break families and then go back to your own house." Eleanor knew the words came from fear. She also knew that understanding pain did not prevent it from causing pain in return. She closed the report she had been reading. "We will speak tomorrow." Clara's anger shifted instantly into alarm, but Eleanor had already gathered her papers. She left Caldermere 2 hours earlier than planned and spent the journey to Briar House despising the part of herself that had chosen distance precisely when the child expected abandonment. Julian came after dusk. He did not bring the report. He brought a sealed letter and asked Miss Avery whether Eleanor would receive him. When she entered the parlor, he remained standing. "I am not here to ask you to change what you wrote," he said. "I need to know how to speak to Clara without making this worse." The request contained no defense and no command. Eleanor indicated the chair opposite hers. They discussed what Clara had heard, what she believed, and what Julian should explain, without promising an outcome he could not control. He listened, took notes, and did not turn the conversation toward his own grievance. Before leaving, he placed the sealed letter on the table. It had been written by his sister Lydia during the final year of her life. Eleanor read it while he waited. Lydia had asked Julian to protect Clara, but the request was more specific than he had ever admitted. She feared her daughter would grow up surrounded by adults who called obedience peace. She asked him never to make decisions about Clara without allowing the girl to speak, even when her wishes could not be granted. "I failed Lydia before she died," Julian said. "I saw that her marriage made her unhappy, but I accepted every assurance that the matter was private. By the time I understood what silence had cost her, there was nothing left to repair." Eleanor folded the letter carefully. For the first time, she saw the full shape of his fear. Julian did not cling to the guardianship only because of duty or pride. He believed losing Clara would prove that he had failed his sister twice. They spoke afterward of the investigation into Thomas Vale's records. Julian referred to the first evidence as something he had understood only after their courtship ended. Then he corrected himself. "After I decided it must end," he said. The distinction was slight, but Eleanor heard it. Julian continued speaking, yet the corrected phrase remained between them like an empty space in a familiar room. She did not know what belonged there. She only knew that something did. Eleanor did not question Julian about the corrected phrase that evening. The conversation had already required more honesty than either of them had expected, and she knew that pressing him while he was still defending himself would produce only another careful answer. She returned Lydia's letter and advised him to tell Clara the truth about the trustees without asking the child to comfort him. The next morning, Julian followed that advice. He explained that Eleanor's report had not ordered anyone to remove Clara from Caldermere. It had described both her progress and the problems that remained. He also admitted that the report had angered him because he had wanted Eleanor's private affection to influence her professional judgment. Clara sat at the end of the breakfast table with the brown notebook closed beneath one hand. She asked whether he still wanted Eleanor to change the report. "No," Julian said. "I wanted that yesterday. Today I understand why she must not." The answer did not repair everything, but it prevented another lie from taking its place. Clara remained angry with Eleanor for 2 days. She attended lessons, answered necessary questions, and refused to use the silver thimble. Eleanor allowed the distance without leaving Caldermere early again. When Clara finally opened the notebook, she wrote only one sentence. "Mrs. Vale came back even when I was cruel." Eleanor read it because Clara pushed the page toward her. She made no comment on the spelling or the accusation hidden within the words. Instead, she asked whether Clara wished to speak about what had happened. "Not yet." "Then we shall not." This time, silence was not an escape. It was an agreement. Lady Augusta returned the following week for a private afternoon visit. Eleanor arranged for Clara to choose the room, the length of the meeting, and the activity. Clara selected the small morning room and requested that they sort ribbons for a sewing project, perhaps because it allowed both of them to look at the table rather than at each other. Augusta arrived with a blue dress she believed would suit Clara better than the brown one the girl had chosen. Clara refused to change. Eleanor expected Augusta to insist, but the older woman examined the child's expression and placed the dress aside. "We shall discuss your taste another day," Augusta said. Clara considered this carefully. "You mean argue?" "Probably." The girl almost smiled. Eleanor remained for the first 5 minutes, then left them alone. She waited in the adjoining room, close enough to hear raised voices but not individual words. No argument came. When Augusta departed 40 minutes later, Clara stood at the entrance and watched the carriage until it passed through the gates. That evening, she wrote in the notebook, "Lady Augusta brought the blue dress. I hated it. She did not make me wear it." The meeting changed more than Clara's view of her grandmother. Julian began to understand that Augusta's presence did not reduce his place in the girl's life. He invited her to attend the next family dinner without the trustees, and Augusta accepted on the condition that Clara would be allowed to leave the table when she wished. The improvement encouraged the trustees. Their next letter stated that Caldermere appeared capable of providing a suitable home if the cooperation continued, and if no further concerns arose regarding the administration of Clara's inheritance. The condition should have troubled Eleanor more than it did. Instead, for several days, Caldermere seemed to settle into a rhythm that no one had planned. Clara studied in the mornings and spent 2 afternoons each week at Briar House. Julian began arranging estate business around the times when she needed him present. Augusta visited without treating every conversation as evidence for her petition. Eleanor remained independent, traveling home most evenings, but the distance between Caldermere and Briar House no longer felt like a defense. It became simply a road she traveled. One rainy evening, flooding made the lower bridge unsafe. Julian offered the guest room again, but this time he did not send servants to prepare it before she answered. "You may remain," he said, "or I will have the North Road checked and arrange a carriage if you prefer to return." Eleanor noticed the choice because he did not emphasize it. "I will remain." The room was prepared after she agreed. Clara spent the evening organizing the brown notebook. Several pages had been folded, one had been torn away, and a drawing of Caldermere had been crossed out so heavily that the pencil had nearly cut through the paper. Eleanor suggested making a cloth cover to protect it. They worked in the library because the schoolroom fire had gone out. Julian joined them after finishing his correspondence and attempted to sort the loose pages by date. Clara objected to his method, moved every page, and then fell asleep before deciding where they belonged. Julian lowered his voice. "She has not done that in months." Eleanor looked at the child curled in the armchair, one hand still resting on the notebook. The room was not silent in the old Caldermere fashion. Rain struck the windows, the fire shifted, and a clock marked each quarter hour. Yet nothing in the sound demanded fear. "I had forgotten what a house sounds like when someone feels safe inside it," Julian said. The words were not meant as praise for Eleanor. That made them more difficult to dismiss. Together, they carried the sewing materials to the long table and began arranging the documents required for the next assessment. Julian opened correspondence from the trustees, while Eleanor reviewed Clara's progress notes. They worked without the guarded politeness that had shaped their first days. At some point, Julian placed a letter beside her. The envelope was yellowed at the edges but remained sealed. Eleanor recognized her own name in his handwriting. "I sent it after you left London," he said. It was returned unopened. She did not touch it. "I kept another." Julian looked at her. "One reached Bath before I instructed the servants to refuse the rest. I carried it for years." "Did you read it?" "No." He asked why she had preserved a letter she had no intention of opening. Eleanor considered giving him the safer answer. She could have said that she kept it as proof of his regret, or as a reminder of what she had survived. Neither would have been entirely false. "I knew I might forgive you if I read it," she said, "and I did not trust myself to forgive a man who still believed he had done the only possible thing." Julian remained still. The rain softened beyond the windows, leaving the room strangely exposed. "I looked for news of you," he said, "not through anyone who might cause scandal. I asked about Bath, then about Thomas's health, and later about Briar House. I knew when you became its director. I knew when the first winter nearly closed it. You never came. I believed my presence would harm you again. You decided that too." "Yes." The admission carried no defense. Julian moved closer to the table, but stopped before entering the space Eleanor had not offered. "Tell me there was one moment when you wished I had followed you." She looked at the unopened letter between them. There were too many. The answer removed the last safe distance from the room. Julian reached for her hand slowly enough that she could refuse. Eleanor allowed his fingers to close around hers. The contact was familiar in a way that time had not erased. It carried no promise, yet for a few seconds she could imagine one. He stepped closer. Eleanor did not move away. Then she remembered the corrected phrase in Briar House and the silence that had followed her questions about Thomas. "Have you told me everything about the documents?" she asked. Julian's hand tightened once before relaxing. The hesitation was brief. It was also unmistakable. "There are records that could damage my position as Clara's guardian," he said. "That was not my question." "I have told you what is necessary for the assessment." Eleanor withdrew her hand. The distance returned, sharper because they had chosen to cross it. "You still believe you can decide which truth another person is able to bear. I am trying to protect Clara, and perhaps you are, but you are also protecting the version of yourself you want me to forgive." Julian did not reach for her again. Eleanor picked up the silver thimble and fastened its chain at her waist. The gesture had once meant that repair remained possible. Now it reminded her that no seam could hold while the damaged fabric was still being hidden. She did not leave Caldermere that night. The bridge remained unsafe, and Clara was asleep upstairs. Eleanor returned to the guest room she had chosen to occupy. For the first time, staying required more strength than leaving. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground around Caldermere remained soft and dark. Eleanor left before breakfast. She told Julian that the road was safe, informed Clara that she would return the following afternoon, and made no reference to the conversation in the library. Julian did not attempt to stop her. The space between them became visible in the days that followed. They continued working, but the ease of the previous week disappeared. Eleanor spoke to him about Clara's lessons, sleep, and visits with Augusta. Julian answered, with the same careful respect he had used when she first arrived. Neither mentioned the unopened letter. Clara noticed the change. She began watching them during meals and asking separate questions about their schedules. When Eleanor planned to return to Briar House, Clara asked whether Julian had made her angry. When Julian left the schoolroom early, she asked Eleanor whether he had decided to send her away. Each answer seemed to create another fear. Eleanor tried to explain that adults could disagree without leaving, but the words sounded less convincing while she was considering whether she could remain involved in Caldermere's affairs. Her work with Clara had become important, so had the trust she had begun rebuilding with Julian, yet the hesitation in the library had confirmed that some part of their past remained hidden behind his authority. The trustees' next letter increased the pressure. They had received questions from Lady Augusta concerning the financial records connected to Clara's inheritance. Because Thomas Vale's name appeared in several early documents, they would conduct a separate review before making a final decision about guardianship. Julian read the notice in his study with Eleanor beside him. His expression did not change, but he folded the page too precisely. "What records are they requesting?" she asked. "Correspondence from the years following Lydia's marriage, estate reports, documents concerning the transfer of Clara's funds. And Thomas's papers? Those as well." Eleanor waited for more. Julian placed the letter on the desk and began discussing the schedule for the review. The omission was deliberate. "You recognized a phrase from Thomas's report last week," she said. "You told me you had not seen the original documents until after our courtship ended. I told you the investigation continued after the courtship ended. That is not the same statement." Julian looked toward the locked cabinet behind his desk. Some records were incomplete. Others arrived without explanation. "Before or after you denied me publicly?" He did not answer at once. Eleanor understood that silence now. It was not uncertainty. It was a calculation. Before she could question him again, a servant entered with a message from Clara's maid. The girl had disappeared from the morning room and could not be found in the schoolroom, library, or garden. Julian was on his feet before the servant finished. They searched the west wing first. Clara had not taken a coat, and the damp paths outside showed no recent footprints, so Eleanor believed she remained inside the house. The servants checked bedrooms and passages, while Julian examined the rooms connected to Lydia's old apartments. Eleanor found the missing notice in the morning room. It had been folded into the brown notebook, beneath a page covered with heavy pencil marks. The paper informed Julian that the trustees were considering a temporary transfer to Fenwick House during the financial review. Clara had read enough to believe the decision had already been made. Eleanor remembered the old sewing room near the nursery corridor. Clara had once asked why no one used it, and Julian had explained that Lydia kept her dolls there as a child. The door was locked from inside. Eleanor did not knock loudly or demand that Clara open it. She sat on the floor beside the door and told the servants to move away. For several minutes there was no answer. Then Clara asked whether Julian was with her.
"He is nearby."
"I do not want him." Julian heard the words from the end of the corridor. He stopped but did not leave. Eleanor explained that the notice did not mean Clara would be moved that day. It meant the trustees were considering what should happen while they examined the accounts. "They have already decided," Clara said through the door. "They always write after they decide." "No, this time they are still deciding. And you will tell them I should go. I will tell them what I believe is true." "That is the same thing." Eleanor rested her hand against the wood. She wanted to promise that Clara would remain at Caldermere. The promise might have opened the door. It would also have been a lie. "I cannot tell you where you will live," she said, "but I can make certain they hear what you want before they decide." The lock did not move. Clara's voice became smaller. "You said you were staying." "I said I would not leave without telling you." "You left before breakfast." "I told you I was going. You wanted to leave." The accusation was true in a way Clara could not understand. Eleanor closed her eyes. "Yes, I was angry and uncertain, and part of me wanted distance, but I returned. Adults may need space without disappearing forever." The lock turned. Clara stood behind the door with her face pale from crying. She did not move toward Eleanor. Instead, she held out the brown notebook. One page had been torn away. "I wrote that I hated you," she said. "You were allowed to write it. I did not want you to see. Then I will not ask to see it." Clara looked past her toward Julian. "Did you know about the letter?" He did not pretend to misunderstand. "I received it this morning. And you did not tell me. I intended to speak with you after I understood what the trustees planned. That means after you decided what to say." Julian accepted the rebuke without correcting her. "Yes." Clara turned back into the room. "I want to go to Briar House today." Julian's first instinct showed in the tightening of his jaw. He wanted to refuse because the request came from fear. Eleanor expected him to explain why remaining at Caldermere was more sensible. Instead, he asked, "For how long?" "Until tomorrow," he agreed. Clara's arrival at Briar House unsettled the other residents less than Eleanor expected. They understood distress without requiring an explanation. Clara spent the afternoon repairing a torn pillowcase and refused to speak about Caldermere. Julian remained at the estate with the trustees' notice and the locked cabinet. The next day, Eleanor returned alone to collect several books Clara had requested. She found Julian in the records room with an elderly former secretary named Mr. Sloane, who had served the previous Duke and remained familiar with the older financial papers. Boxes covered the long table. Julian was examining a list of transfers while Sloane searched for correspondence from Thomas Vale. "The first report is not here," the old man said. "Only the second copy." Julian's hand stopped above the page. Eleanor remained in the doorway. "What first report?" Sloane turned, surprised to see her. "The one delivered before the London inquiry, Mrs. Vale. His Grace received another copy later because the original lacked several attachments." Julian dismissed him with unusual speed. Sloane gathered his notes and left, but the information remained. Eleanor entered the room. "You received a copy before the inquiry." "It was anonymous. That was not my question. The papers contained claims that could not be verified. Did they clear me?" Julian looked at the cabinet at the far end of the room. That glance told her where the answer was kept. Eleanor crossed the room and reached for the key lying beside the account books. Julian moved between her and the cabinet. "These records concern Clara's inheritance. I am authorized to review any record affecting her welfare or the investigation. Not without context." "Whose context?" "Eleanor." The use of her name sounded like a plea, but his body still blocked the door. She felt the last weeks gather behind the moment. The room prepared before she agreed, the report he had expected her to soften, the hesitation in the library, and every assurance that he was withholding only what others did not need to know. "You promised access to relevant information. I am asking you to wait. For you to decide what I may read? For me to explain before you judge? You had years to explain." Julian did not move. Eleanor stepped back, not in surrender but in recognition. "Then I will request the records from the trustees under my formal authority." She left him standing before the cabinet. The authorization arrived that afternoon. By evening, the locked box was open on the table at Briar House. Inside lay the first copy of Thomas Vale's report, the record of its delivery to Caldermere, and a letter written in Thomas's hand. Eleanor recognized the writing before she touched the page. Thomas had stated clearly that she possessed no knowledge of the irregular accounts and had never attempted to use the documents for money, influence, or social advantage. He warned that any public attack on her character would serve only those who wished to protect the estate from scrutiny. Near the end, he had written one final sentence. If Ashcombe sacrifices Eleanor's name to preserve his authority, he will prove that the title matters more to him than the woman. The letter had been received 12 days before Julian publicly declared that he had never intended to marry her. Eleanor read the letter twice. The first reading gave her the facts. The second returned every fact to the life it had damaged. 12 days before Julian stood in a crowded London drawing room and dismissed their courtship as a misunderstanding, he had known that Thomas did not accuse her. He had known she possessed no secret document, had demanded no payment, and had made no attempt to influence the inquiry. Caution might still have required distance between them, but it had not required humiliation. She placed the letter beside the delivery record and sat without moving. Miss Avery waited near the office door. She had not read the papers, but she had watched Eleanor defend Thomas's name for 8 years and understood what the handwriting meant. "Shall I send for a solicitor?" she asked. "Not yet." "For the Duke?" Eleanor looked at the date again. "He knows where I am." Julian arrived before midnight. He had traveled without servants and entered Briar House with rain on his shoulders. Eleanor received him in the office where the documents remained spread across the desk. She did not offer him a chair. His eyes went first to Thomas's letter. "I should have told you," he said. "That is a smaller truth than the one on this table." Julian removed his gloves slowly. He did not attempt to claim the document was false or incomplete. Instead, he explained that the first report had arrived without a signature on the outer package. The allegations concerned men connected to Clara's inheritance, including advisors trusted by both families. If the contents became public before they were verified, the trustees might have removed him from Lydia's affairs. Eleanor listened until he began describing the risk to Clara. "You believed Thomas. I believed enough of it to continue the inquiry." "And you believed I was innocent?" "Yes." The word left no room for misunderstanding. Eleanor placed one hand on the delivery record. "Then why did you stand before people who knew of our courtship and say I had imagined your intentions?" Julian's face showed the answer before he gave it. The inquiry had already drawn attention. A known courtship between the Duke responsible for Clara's estate and the wife of the man supplying evidence could have been presented as influence, payment, or conspiracy. Julian had feared losing access to the records and feared that Thomas would be silenced if the wrong men learned how much he knew. "The courtship had to end," Julian said. "I believed a clean separation would protect the investigation. A respectful separation would have ended it." "It might not have convinced them." "So, you chose the version that protected you most completely." He did not deny it. Eleanor had once spent months inventing explanations kinder than the truth. She had imagined that Julian was pressured by his family, deceived by advisors, or forced to speak before learning what Thomas had discovered. Even after returning to Caldermere, she had begun to accept that his cruelty might have been the cost of protecting a child. The letter destroyed that comfort. "You allowed society to believe I had pursued you for position," she said. "You allowed them to connect Thomas's disgrace to my character. You knew I had done nothing, yet you made my innocence less useful than your authority. I thought I could repair the damage after the inquiry. You never did. Thomas died before the records were complete. Lydia's condition worsened. The trustees, those are consequences. They are not the choice." Julian looked at the documents but did not reach for them. "I was afraid." The admission was quiet and without dignity. "I was afraid they would remove me from Clara's affairs. I was afraid Lydia would be left with men I did not trust. I was afraid that if I told you everything, you would insist on standing beside Thomas publicly, and I would no longer be able to control what happened." Eleanor felt no satisfaction in hearing him name it. "You decided what I would do before asking me." "Yes." "You decided what disgrace I could survive." "Yes." And when I returned to Caldermere, you told me only enough to make your decision appear necessary. Julian's silence answered. Eleanor moved away from the desk. The room felt too small for the years between the letter and the present. You did not lie because you did not love me. You lied because loving me did not matter as much as keeping the right to decide. His expression tightened, but he did not protest. That was the deepest wound. Julian had loved her. He had simply believed love gave him permission to choose the burden she would carry. I cannot change what I did, he said. No, but you could have told the truth before I found it. I wanted to. You wanted forgiveness before confession. The words struck him harder than anger would have done. Julian looked toward the window, where the dark glass reflected both of them without bringing them closer. What will you do with the papers? Eleanor understood the question. The records could affect his guardianship, reopen the financial inquiry, and damage his standing with the trustees. Once, he would have decided which pages she could see. Now he stood before her knowing that the decision belonged to someone else. I have not decided. He accepted the answer. I will return to Caldermere in the morning, he said. Clara is still here. She should not wake and discover that we have both gone. Eleanor's attention shifted toward the upper floor, where Clara slept in one of the residence rooms. The child had already lost parents, governesses, homes, and every promise that adults would remain predictable. Eleanor's anger at Julian did not remove her responsibility to Clara. I will speak with her before you leave. Julian nodded, then looked once more at Thomas's letter. He judged me correctly. Thomas warned you. You judged yourself by ignoring him. Julian left without asking whether she would come back. Clara knew something had happened before Eleanor entered her room the next morning. The girl was sitting upright in bed with the brown notebook pressed against her chest. Uncle Julian came. Yes? Are you angry with him? Yes. Clara looked toward the door. Will you still go to the hearing? Eleanor sat in the chair beside the bed. She refused to offer a comforting answer before she possessed an honest one. I do not know. If you do not go, they will send me away. The decision does not belong to me alone. You said you would make them listen. I will make certain your wishes are recorded, but I cannot stand beside your uncle while he continues hiding the truth. Clara's fingers tightened around the notebook. Then make him tell it. I cannot make him. You make me tell things. I ask you. Sometimes I wait. Sometimes I tell you there will be consequences, but the choice to speak is still yours. Clara looked unconvinced. Children recognize differences in power even when adults explain them carefully. Will you leave me too? Eleanor wanted to say no. Instead, she chose a promise she could keep. I will return to Briar House today, and you may remain here until tomorrow if your uncle agrees. After that, I will tell you where I am going before I go. I will not disappear. It was not enough to make Clara feel safe. It was enough to remain true. Before leaving the room, Eleanor noticed the silver thimble resting beside the sewing basket. Clara had used it the previous evening while repairing a loose seam in the notebook cover. Eleanor removed the chain from the table and fastened it at her own waist. Clara watched the movement. Why are you taking it? Because the repair is not finished. The girl looked down at the notebook, but she did not ask Eleanor to leave it behind. Eleanor returned to Caldermere only long enough to collect her papers and inform the trustees that she was suspending her participation in the hearing. Her written observations could not be used selectively, and she would not support any account that described Julian's past conduct as an unavoidable sacrifice. Mr. Harcourt warned that her absence might weaken Julian's case and increase the chance of a temporary transfer to Fenwick House. I understand. Do you believe Clara should be removed? I believe no decision should be made until the financial records are complete and Clara has been heard directly. Will you present that recommendation? When His Grace releases every relevant document and stops controlling the account of his own actions. Julian stood near the library fireplace while she spoke. He did not challenge her conditions or ask the trustees to exclude Thomas's letter. After the men departed, Eleanor placed the room key on his desk. It was the same key she had rejected on her first day at Caldermere. "I will not ask you to stay," he said. "No. And I will not ask you to protect me." No. Julian looked older than he had when he first arrived at Briar House, but Eleanor would not confuse suffering with transformation. Regret required feeling. Change required a decision that could cost him something. She left Caldermere before noon. From the carriage window, she saw Julian standing on the front steps. He did not follow her, send a rider after her, or arrange what she should do next. For once, he allowed the consequence to leave with her. Julian spent the afternoon in the records room. For years, he had believed that keeping the papers under his control was a form of responsibility. He knew which names could damage the estate, which accusations remained unproven, and which details might be used against Clara. Every locked cabinet had seemed like a wall placed between his family and danger. Now the same cabinets looked like evidence of the danger he had created. Mr. Sloane returned before dusk and found the Duke sorting the files into 3 groups: documents already known to the trustees, records connected to Thomas Vale, and correspondence Julian had never allowed anyone outside the family to examine. "There are letters here from men who still hold public positions," Sloane warned. "I know. Some will deny their contents. They may. And these dates could suggest that you withheld information during the first inquiry." Julian placed another letter in the final group. "They do not suggest it." Sloane understood. "No, Your Grace," Julian wrote through the night. He prepared a statement describing when each document had arrived, who had seen it, and why he had chosen to keep it private. He did not call his choices unavoidable. He did not claim that every delay had protected Clara. Where fear had influenced him, he named it. Where pride had shaped a decision, he wrote that too. By morning, the statement contained enough to weaken his position as guardian and enough to reopen questions about the administration of Clara's inheritance. It was the first honest account he had ever prepared without controlling how the reader should judge him. 2 days later, Eleanor received a large sealed box at Briar House. There was no personal letter on top, no request that she return, and no explanation of what Julian hoped she would do. The box contained Thomas's complete records, the estate correspondence, Julian's written statement, and a signed authorization allowing her to present any part of the material to the trustees. A separate document proposed that Clara's fortune be transferred to an independent financial board. Julian would remain responsible for her daily welfare if the guardianship continued, but he would surrender direct control over the money and accept regular review. Miss Avery read the proposal and looked at Eleanor. "He may lose the guardianship by submitting this." "Yes." "Does he know that?" "He wrote it himself." Eleanor examined the authorization again. Julian had not asked her to protect Caldermere, Clara, or him. He had handed her information capable of harming all 3 and accepted that she would decide how it should be used. That did not repair the past. It did something more difficult. It removed his hand from her decision. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday in York. Eleanor informed the trustees that she would attend. Her letter made clear that she appeared as an independent observer and as the person responsible for presenting Thomas Vale's records, not as an ally of the Duke. She did not write to Julian. He learned of her decision from Mr. Harcourt. The hearing took place in a private chamber above the trustees' offices. There was no public gallery, but the people present represented every force that had shaped Clara's life. Julian sat with his solicitor. Lady Augusta occupied the opposite side of the room. Eleanor chose a separate table, neither beside him nor beside Augusta. Clara waited in another office with Miss Avery. The trustees had agreed that she would be called only after the adults presented their evidence. Lady Augusta spoke first. She did not accuse Julian of lacking affection. She described a household in which servants waited for his decisions, records remained locked, and Clara's daily life had repeatedly changed without her understanding why. She also questioned whether the girl's improvement depended too heavily on Eleanor's presence. If Mrs. Vale returns permanently to Briar House, Augusta said, what remains at Caldermere besides a man who loves Clara but has not yet learned how to share the work of loving her? The question was fair. Julian did not object. When Eleanor's turn came, she presented no perfect picture of Caldermere. Clara's sleep had improved, her lessons had become more consistent, and she had begun speaking directly to both Julian and Augusta. Yet she still hid information when afraid, tested adults through defiance, and relied on Eleanor to carry conversations she needed to face herself. Eleanor also acknowledged her own mistake. "I became a refuge before I became a guide," she said. "Clara trusted me because I did not force her. For a time, I allowed that trust to become a way for her to avoid other relationships. Lady Augusta was correct to question it." Augusta's expression changed slightly. She had expected resistance, not recognition. Eleanor then described Julian's progress. He had begun consulting Clara before making changes, had accepted Augusta's visits, and had not attempted to alter the unfavorable report. Those actions mattered. They did not erase his history of control. The trustees asked whether Eleanor believed Clara should remain at Caldermere. "I believe she may remain there safely only if no adult has exclusive authority over her future." Julian looked at her, but she continued addressing the trustees. She recommended independent management of the inheritance, regular contact with Augusta, continued educational support through Briar House, and a formal requirement that Clara be informed before significant decisions. She also requested that the girl be heard directly. Before the trustees could respond, Julian rose. His solicitor touched his sleeve, but Julian stepped away from the table. "I have another statement." Mr. Harcourt reminded him that he was not required to speak beyond the prepared evidence. Julian replied that requirement had guided too many of his choices already. He began with Eleanor. He stated that he had courted her with serious intentions and had expected to marry her. His public denial had been false. Although the investigation required caution and might have required the end of their courtship, it had not required him to damage her dignity. He explained that Thomas Vale's first report had reached him before the public rejection. By then, he knew Eleanor had no part in the disputed accounts. He had used her reputation as protection because humiliating her offered the quickest and safest separation. "I called it sacrifice because that description allowed me to remain honorable in my own judgment," he said. "It was fear made respectable by my title." No one interrupted. Julian admitted that he had withheld documents, controlled information, and expected others to trust decisions he refused to explain. He had repeated the same behavior with Clara and later with Eleanor when she returned. He submitted the proposal removing himself from direct control of Clara's fortune. If the trustees decided that his conduct made him unfit to remain guardian, he would accept the decision. He would not use Clara's affection as proof that the financial authority should remain his. Lady Augusta watched him with an expression Eleanor could not immediately read. It was not victory. Julian had removed the contest she had expected to win. Mr. Harcourt called for Clara. She entered holding the brown notebook against her dress. The room, filled with adults and dark furniture, made her appear younger than 11. Eleanor moved as though to approach her, then stopped. Clara looked around and chose the chair placed between the two sides of the room. The trustees asked simple questions. Did she feel safe at Caldermere? Most days. What frightened her there? People talking in other rooms. Did she want to live with Lady Augusta? I want to visit. Did she want to remain with Julian? Yes. Clara glanced at Eleanor before answering the final question. But I want Grandmama to come, and I want to keep going to Briar House. Mr. Bellamy asked what she wanted the adults to change. Clara's hands tightened around the notebook. For a moment, Eleanor feared the room had demanded too much from her. Then Clara spoke. I want everyone to stop sending people away before telling me. No speech could have expressed the conflict more clearly. She placed the notebook on the table and allowed the trustees to examine selected pages. The records were not polished evidence. Words were misspelled. A drawing of Caldermere had been crossed out. One page was missing, and another blamed Eleanor for leaving. There were also simple entries about sleeping longer, asking Julian questions, and spending time with Augusta without being forced. The notebook proved no adult had solved Clara. It proved that she had begun to speak. The trustees withdrew for nearly an hour. When they returned, Mr. Harcourt stated that Julian would remain Clara's guardian under permanent conditions. The girl's fortune would be transferred to an independent board. Caldermere would receive regular reviews, and Lady Augusta would have formal visitation and extended stays agreed upon in advance. Eleanor would continue overseeing Clara's educational plan through Briar House, but neither her position nor the institution's finances would depend on Julian. Lady Augusta could have objected. Instead, she looked at Clara and withdrew her request for exclusive custody. "If I remove her against her expressed wishes," Augusta said, "I become another person deciding that love excuses silence." Julian lowered his head in acknowledgement. The trustees also accepted Thomas Vale's records for a separate public correction. His reputation would not be restored in a single afternoon, but the official accusation of personal theft would no longer stand unchallenged. The hearing ended without celebration. Julian had kept Clara, but he had lost the authority he once believed necessary to protect her. Eleanor had helped secure the outcome, but she had made no promise to return to him. Outside the chamber, Clara moved first toward Julian, then stopped and looked at Augusta. After a moment, she held out one hand to each of them. Eleanor remained several steps away. Julian met her eyes across the corridor. He did not approach, thank her, or ask what the hearing meant for them. He simply waited. For the first time, Eleanor saw that waiting was not always silence. Sometimes it was respect. The changes ordered at the hearing began before anyone had time to become comfortable with them. Within a week, Julian signed the papers transferring Clara's fortune to an independent board. He opened the remaining family records to review and accepted a schedule of visits from the trustees. Lady Augusta received fixed days at Caldermere and the right to invite Clara to Fenwick House for short stays agreed upon in advance. Julian followed every condition without asking whether obedience would improve Eleanor's opinion of him. He informed Clara before meetings, explained decisions in language she could understand, and allowed her to disagree without treating disagreement as defiance. The first changes were not graceful. Clara complained that the new financial board contained too many old men. She argued with Augusta over breakfast hours and refused to pack the blue dress for her first visit to Fenwick House. When Julian suggested that she take it in case it became useful, Clara reminded him that suggestions from dukes often sounded like commands. He apologized and removed the dress from the trunk himself. At Briar House, Eleanor received confirmation that the trustees and several families would support a permanent educational agreement. The funding did not come from Caldermere, and no single household could control the institution. Eleanor would remain director, Miss Avery would continue overseeing daily lessons, and the older girls would be allowed to train for paid positions rather than leave at an arbitrary age. The agreement gave Briar House the security Eleanor had wanted for years. It also forced her to admit that accepting partnership had not destroyed her independence. The public correction concerning Thomas came more slowly. Newspapers that had once repeated the accusations against him showed little interest in admitting error. Still, the trustees issued a formal statement confirming that he had reported irregularities rather than created them. His name was removed from the record of suspected theft. Eleanor placed a copy of the statement in the Briar House office. She did not frame it. Justice had arrived too late to return the years Thomas had lost, but it had arrived clearly enough that no one could now pretend the truth remained uncertain. Julian did not attend the small gathering held in Thomas's honor. He sent no flowers and made no public claim to have helped restore the name. He understood that his presence would turn another man's vindication into a story about the Duke's regret. That restraint mattered to Eleanor. She still did not write to him. 3 weeks after the hearing, Julian came to Briar House by appointment. He arrived in an ordinary carriage and waited in the entrance hall while Eleanor finished a meeting. He had not asked the servants to announce him twice, nor had he brought documents requiring an immediate answer. When Eleanor entered the parlor, he stood and placed a sealed letter on the table between them. It was the letter she had kept unopened for years. "I found it among the papers you returned," he said. "It belongs to you. You could have read it." "I had no right." Eleanor sat across from him. "Why did you come?" "To ask whether I may visit again." The simplicity of the request surprised her. Julian did not speak of love, marriage, or the future they had once imagined. He told her only that Clara had settled into the new arrangement, that Augusta had begun visiting Caldermere without bringing legal papers, and that he was learning how often a household changed when people were allowed to answer before he acted. "I do not expect you to trust me because I behaved correctly for several weeks," he said. "I only ask whether you are willing to see what I do next." Eleanor looked at the old letter. "I used to believe my independence was the only part of my life no one could take from me. I made it so complete that no one could enter it either." Julian did not mistake the admission for forgiveness. "You survived what I did by leaving," he said. "I will not ask you to regret that. I do not regret it. Nor should you." She broke the seal. The letter contained no secret capable of changing the past. Julian had written that he loved her, that he had acted badly, and that he could not yet explain why. He had asked her to wait until he could make everything right. Eleanor folded it after reading. "You still believed you could repair the damage before telling me what caused it." "Yes. You were not ready for me then." "No." The answer held no attempt to soften itself. Julian looked toward the window, where two girls were carrying folded cloth from the laundry room. "I cannot promise that fear will never make me want control again." "Good," Eleanor replied. "I cannot promise that fear will never make me leave before anyone can ask me to stay." He looked back at her. "What can we promise?" he asked. "That we ask before deciding for each other." Julian considered the words with the seriousness he once reserved for legal agreements. "I can promise that." Eleanor allowed him to visit again the following week. Then again after that. Their new courtship did not resemble the old one. Julian came to Briar House when invited. Eleanor went to Caldermere without occupying the guest room unless she chose to remain. They disagreed about Clara, money, and the amount of freedom older residents should receive. Neither mistook disagreement for betrayal. Months passed before Julian asked whether Eleanor might consider marrying him. He did not ask in front of Clara, the trustees, or society. He asked in the Briar House garden while Eleanor was cutting dead stems from the winter roses. She told him that she would consider it. Julian smiled. "May I hope?" Yes. It was enough. By spring, Clara had divided her life into a pattern she had helped create. She spent most weeks at Caldermere, visited Fenwick House regularly, and attended lessons at Briar House twice each week. She continued to test the adults around her. She forgot promises, hid one unpleasant school report, and once told Augusta that her hats frightened the horses. Her apologies rarely came directly. After insulting Augusta's hats, she repaired a torn ribbon and left it on her grandmother's dressing table. After lying to Julian, she wrote the truth in the brown notebook and placed it beside his breakfast plate. When she became angry with Eleanor, she no longer tore out the page. She folded it until she was ready to speak. One afternoon, Clara finished the linen cover for the notebook. The cloth had been torn near one corner. She repaired it with the silver thimble and left the seam visible. The stitches were not even, but they held. Eleanor examined the work. "You could cover the line with another piece of cloth." Clara shook her head. "Then I might forget where it broke." Julian entered the workroom carrying a letter from Augusta. He stopped beside the table and looked at the finished cover. "May I see it?" he asked. Clara handed it to him. He examined the seam, then asked where she wished to keep the notebook. "Sometimes here," Clara said. "Sometimes at Caldermere." "And at Fenwick House?" Clara considered the question. "Perhaps when Grandmama buys a better hat." Eleanor laughed before she could prevent it. Julian looked toward her, but he did not reach for her hand until she offered it. Outside, Augusta's carriage turned through the gate at the agreed hour. Clara placed the notebook inside its repaired cover and carried it toward the door. The line of stitches remained visible. Nothing had been returned to the way it was before. It had been made strong enough to continue.